Hello, I'm Dr. Matthew Minard with Maritain Musings, and I'm really pleased today to have a former president of the AMA, I think 2 terms,
James.
Dr. John Trapani from Walsh University, an emeritus professor there, uh, here to talk to us today about Maritain's philosophy of aesthetics, philosophy of art. So, Dr. Trapani, I'd like to welcome you here to the Maritain Musings
It's a
podcast.
pleasure to be here, Matthew, and thank you very much.
Well, for those of you who may not know or have reverence for Dr. Trapani, I'm at least going to ice break for the people who are coming in and they might be fly on the wall of these. I still have a very warm memory of the first AMA I ever went to where you were stepping down from your last tenure as president. And you just gave a talk that was effectively Why You Love Maritain was the title of it. And you just went through a number of themes from Maritain that just sort of inspired a love in you. And I really appreciated it at the time. And I'm glad that I've gotten to know you. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So
Thank you.
for those who don't know of Dr. Trapani's work, which we'll pitch at the end. So that'll make you stay all the way till the end. So you have to listen to find the title. He's an expert in the aesthetic writings, the writings on philosophy of art by Maritain, and it has a text with CUA Press that we'll pitch at the end. But I'm going to have us just jump right in, John. So I just want you to have at it with the question of what is the fundamental uniqueness of Maritain's philosophy of art?
Thank you. I mean, that's a great question. And I think that Maritain's philosophy of art, he does not prefer to use the word aesthetics because it has other connotations. In Maritain's philosophy of art, and my first encounter with it, I think it is captured because it contains so much. I think it is captured on the first page of Maritain's master work called Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry. And there he defines what he means by poetry. For the ordinary reader, listener, in any discussion, you hear poetry and you think of the art of writing verse. And Maritain explicitly makes clear that's not how he's understanding the word. And in fact, his definition is, and I'm quoting now, the intercommunication between the inner being of things and the inner being of the human self. And he capitalizes the S on self. So my first encounter with that definition, I was in the fall of my sophomore year at Boston College. This was the fall of 1965. I had an aesthetics course with a woman whose name was Idella Gallagher. And at the time, I didn't know who she was. I was interested in a philosophy of art course, and I signed up for, it and whoever was teaching it. And this book of Maritain's was one of the assigned readings. At the time, I was not a philosophy major. I had no real exposure to the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, and that becomes part of a context into which Maritain's philosophy of art is rightly situated. So I didn't know any of those things. I lived off campus in a house. Actually, there was the family. The guy was a drummer. Is how he made his living, and I had a single room. I didn't my freshman year. I did my sophomore year, and I remember as if it were yesterday. Still, because it was such a profound, I'll call it a spiritual moment. I was sitting by myself and I picked up this book. It was in a paperback. and I opened it up, and I was all alone, and I read that first paragraph, and I get to that line about the intercommunication between the inner being of things and the inner being of the human self. And I was just arrested. And, later in that early chapter, Maritain defines what he means by things and what he means by the human self. But in that moment, I read it and I got it. Now, part of the context for that is when I was in the third grade, this is in the mid-50s, I took trumpet lessons. And as it turns out, I was reasonably good at it. And I had a very interesting, full, and eventful career in music, actually my whole life. It started then. By the time I got to high school, I went 2 years to the all-state orchestra. I grew up on Long Island, and so this was in New York State. And for 2 years, I went all-state orchestra. I thought I was going to go into music. My dad lowered the hammer and said, "Nope, you will get a liberal arts education, and then you can do whatever you want." So when I went to Boston College, at the time, they do now, they had no orchestra and they had no jazz or dance band, whatever word you want to call it. And so I started one. And so for 4 years, there was the Boston College Eagles, so it was the Eagles of Sound. And we went to the MIT Jazz Festival. We went to the very first Quinnipiac Jazz Festival. So it was a group of good musicians, and we rose to the occasion. By the time I graduated, the war of Vietnam was at its peak, and I wasn't going to get any graduate deferments. So I joined the Army so that I could play, and I was in the Army band and stationed in Germany. And I mention all of these things because while I was at Boston College, I auditioned for and played in the Harvard Radcliffe Orchestra. And I did that for 3 years, my sophomore, junior, senior years. And so I had this background of performance in great classical music, but I was also doing a lot of jazz band music as well. And I say that as a background because when I heard Maritain's intercommunication between the inner being of things and the inner being of the self, that for me was a eureka moment. I just got it. And later, when I would learn more about Aquinas and Maritain as a Thomist philosopher, as it turns out, this Idella Gallagher, I had her husband, Donald Gallagher, later. And as it turns out, Donald Gallagher was the first president of the American Maritain Association, and he and his wife were friends of the Maritains. And so I was really in good company then right away, even though at the time I didn't know it. And when you hear that inner being of things, it's a clear reference to a Thomistic created universe that is saturated with the intelligibility of God, and it presupposes this metaphysics of Aquinas that is a created universe, as I'm saying, where the universe itself is saturated with intelligibility. And then you have the inner being of the human self, and that, of course, is also a spiritual a dimension of the human person. And the modern way of thinking is that we think with our brains. And while there's a dimension of that that's surely true, you can't think without it, a useful distinction, I get this from Mortimer Adler, is what he calls necessary and sufficient, and necessary but not sufficient. And the brain is a necessary condition of human intellectual thought, but it is not a sufficient explanation. In the tradition of Aquinas, human beings also possess an intellect. It's a real thing. We have an intellect that works in such harmony with the brain as to give us the unique human abilities that we have. Now, the difficulty with that is that when people think that you can explain all human thought simply by reference to the brain alone, that really opens the door to a reductionist materialist or materialism that basically explains the human person simply by the sum total of our material dimension. And I don't think that's an adequate explanation. And what it misses is the depth that we have of not only the universe on the one hand, but of the human person on the other. And Maritain was saying, by poetry, I mean the intercommunication between these two things. And I think that is the underlying fundamental uniqueness of Maritain's aesthetics. And I want to add hastily, you miss that and you miss Maritain's aesthetics. I did a book review for a book. It did eventually get published, to my surprise, and it was what someone had written back in the late 50s on Maritain's, now I'm going to call it aesthetics. And in that book, the word poetry doesn't show up at all. And to me, I couldn't see how you could do that without a reference to poetry. And so that seems to me to be the fundamental uniqueness with all that it entails or implies.
Good. Okay, good. So it's like our background principle that's going to hover over the rest of the specifics that we come to. I think yeah, go ahead.
Let me interject here that what was a complete surprise to me, it was a very slow discovery. And this now takes me after the Army. I'm in graduate school. And I had so I had the great good fortune to be a grad assistant for John Rowan. And as I like to say, he's one of the great philosophers that people never heard of. But John Rowan did the translation that published by Regnery Press of St. Thomas Aquinas's commentary on the metaphysics of Aristotle. And he did it from the original Greek for Aristotle and the original Latin. I went to school at St. John's University in Jamaica, New York, and he lived in Vermont. And he would come down a few days a week. He had one of the homes of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. And he was such a down-to-earth, commonsensical Scotsman I can't tell you the debt that I owe to this man. And as I was finishing up, and now I have to write my dissertation, I asked him to be my director. And he said, I would love to, but I'm retiring now and I can't because I won't be with you long enough. So I asked a priest who was on the faculty there at the time. And, Maritain's notion of poetry involves what is called non-conceptual thought. And I used this expression to him, and he said, non-conceptual in Aquinas? No such thing. And I said, no, really? I said that basically poetry operating in the creative artist, Maritain says this, is to the work of art what the concept is to conceptual thought and language. And he said, no way, it's not possible. And I said, really? I'll show you. And that was one of the biggest mistakes I ever made in my life. No, because I showed him the text, and all he said was, that's very curious, very curious. And long story short, he did not direct my dissertation, and basically, for a while, stood in the way. He became chair of the department just as I was trying to get this project approved. Yeah. And he stood in my way for a number of years until there was a new chair, and et cetera, et cetera. So I use that expression about non-conceptual knowledge because in addition to the context of Thomistic thought, metaphysics in particular, and that involves the human person as a spiritual, intellectual being, those concepts are absolutely essential. But at the ground, and this is what emerges from poetry, is Maritain's notion of the word intuition and connaturality. And those are two specifically Thomist concepts that Maritain in the 20th century, 700 years or practically so, after Aquinas, that Maritain takes advantage of centuries of the development of thinking, of science, of etc., and he comes to expand upon the notions of connaturality and intuition. And if I may, since I don't know who might likely be viewing this podcast and the philosophical sophistication that he or she may or may not have, the best way, I think, is from Aquinas to introduce connaturality is Aquinas contrasts a person who asks of two people a particular moral question. And he says the first person is a moral theologian who answers the question correctly by consulting what he knows. The second person to whom the question is given is a simple peasant who has no intellectual sophistication at all, but, Aquinas says, who, by consulting what she is as a person, is also able to give the right answer, even though there is no conceptual foundation. So, connaturality and this non-conceptual thought really are friends, you know, and all of that is what Maritain captures in his use of the word poetry. Now, in a book on Maritain's aesthetics that I did back in 2011, I suggest in it, and I mentioned that I will capitalize the word poetry every time I'm using it in the same sense in which Maritain defined it. I don't think that caught on, unfortunately, because the fact that this word is used in so many other ways just invites not only confusion, but I think it invites an easy misunderstanding of the uniqueness of Maritain's aesthetics. For me, I know of no other aesthetics or philosophy of art that hits the nail on the head in exactly the same way that Maritain's philosophy of art does. There are other aesthetics, but they tend to adhere more to Aquinas and trying to get a perfect consistency with Aquinas. And I think in the process, they miss some of the richness of Maritain's aesthetics that makes it so unique. Sorry, I'm talking more, but
No, this is exactly actually how I've said I want the format to be. Is the idea is that I'm here to allow,
and I don't want to stop.
to allow the expert to talk. That's the point. I'm going to have us eventually double back around and talk a little bit about what might have led Maritain. What were the kind of sources that helped to explain why he would have undertaken this project, right? What context he had, what in his life would have kind of helped nudge him in the direction of doing this in the 20s. But we're in the midst of kind of talking about some of the particular elements, and I want to keep us in that vein because I think it might help to the listener, because this can come across as being kind of heady and abstract, right? When we talk about a notion of poetry that's relatively unfamiliar, we'll say, to normal discourse.
Yeah.
So I want to actually keep going through maybe some other particular topics that are related to this, because you've already talked about effectively the contextual bits that are necessary regarding the human person, a bit about connaturality and intuition, and I want to seize on the connaturality topic, because that's very much associated with Maritain, as you know, in his theories of natural law, because he also applies this, because that text you're speaking of, he talks about how basically the virtuous person with the virtue of chastity judges correctly in matters of chastity.
Yeah.
And he points out, he says, the peasant, the simple man doesn't have moral philosophy or theology kind of at the handle, and yet can answer, definitively about these things, because he or she can guide their own life to make these prudential judgments.
On the consultation is that person on what he or she is. Yes. Mm-hmm. And so that is a non-conceptual, but it's an embodiment, which I think refers to that inner being of the human self.
Yeah.
Because it's not what that person knows. It's rather what he or she is. And I think that makes the difference. Now, how did Maritain come to do this? Well, so as you mentioned at the start about that talk that I gave as I was stepping down after 6 years as president of the Maritain Association, why I love Jacques Maritain. And the reason is because I have found so many things in him that answered intellectual questions, but, and I'm now capitalizing the word, I think Maritain was a poet. Not a poet in the sense of someone who writes verse, but had the soul, the person of a true poet. And in fact, it might be in art and Maritain's book, Art and Poetry, but Maritain even makes a reference to the fact that poetry can occur in a person like Jeremiah, who only knows how to say, ah, ah, ah. And there's a kind of artistry, I don't know, poetry in Maritain's writings. Not always, but they're flashes of poetic brilliance that make reading him, and he can be very difficult. Not uncommon for Maritain to have a whole paragraph that's one sentence. So he can be very difficult to read. So it's the soul of Maritain, and so is that, I think, lent itself to what I'm calling this poetic temperament. As I learned more about him and his youth, I learned also that in his youth, he had lessons in drawing and painting, and that he and a good friend of his used to write poetry together. By the time he goes to university, the Sorbonne at the time was really dominated by what we could call a scientific positivism, that science is the answer to all things, but there was no real spiritual dimension or spiritual life of meaning to which one could avail. And there was a very touching accounting, and this occurs in the woman who became Maritain's wife, Raissa Maritain, in the 40s, and they meet in the early teens, not teens, sorry, the early aughts of the beginning of the 20th century. And Raissa writes, we have been friends together. And this is a kind of reflection on their whole life together, Maritain and Raissa. And in there, I was shocked when I learned that in the early years of their courting, of their dating time, they actually made a suicide pact together, because they found no meaning or meaningful life in what they were learning in the Sorbonne at the time. And so they made a suicide pact that if they didn't find meaning in 1 year's time, then they were going to take their lives together as friends, because there was nothing that was meaningful to make their life worth living. And shortly after that, Maritain, I suspect Raissa too, but Maritain attends the lectures of the French philosopher Henri Bergson. And Bergson, as many will know, but for those who don't, is a philosopher who tried to answer a kind of Kantian view of the universe, where the human mind is constructive of the universe in which we live. And Bergson was the first one in modern philosophy to come up with the idea that over against conceptual thinking, we have intuition. And that for Bergson, intuition can be a grasping of insights that conceptual thought is like a picture on a photograph, whereas for Bergson, intuition is a kind of a stream of conscious awareness that you and I have at this very moment. And Maritain will later, from a Catholic and a novelist, Léon Blois, who again eventually becomes the godfather of Jacques and Raïssa when they make their conversion to Catholicism. Bergson is a very deeply, I said Bergson, I meant Blois, a very deeply and profoundly committed Catholic. And so once the Catholic Maritain discovers Thomas Aquinas, and he's Catholic for 4, maybe 5 years before Raïssa turns him on to the writings of Thomas Aquinas. She actually discovers Aquinas first because of her spiritual director, Father Clarizac, who was a Dominican, and Aquinas is a Dominican. And so she begins to read Aquinas and turns Maritain on to Aquinas in that direction. So that's it. I think my memory is correct that it's somewhere around 1909. Maritain's first book doesn't come out until 1919. And I get confused between the original publication and the translation. But that first book of Maritain's is called Bergsonian Philosophy and Thomism. And basically, it's a Thomistic critique of the philosophy of Bergson. Maritain loved Bergson. There is anecdotal evidence that he, possibly Raïssa too, may have been at Bergson's bedside when he died. Possibly even a deathbed conversion on Bergson's part. While he was critical of Bergson because of the truth that he had learned from St. Thomas, he always held Bergson in highest esteem and highest affection. And so Maritain is going to say that because of the spiritual dimension and the spiritual intellect of the human person, connaturality and intuition become fundamental to this notion of poetry. And in fact, in my book, there's a chart of 5 or 6 different ways in which Maritain uses the word intuition. Some are consistent with Thomas, others go as an extension. I think perfectly consistent with Thomas's thought, but as an extension. And the same is true of connaturality, that Maritain mentions these 5, 6 different uses of connaturality that, again, are consistent with an extension of Aquinas. All of them come back to and are rooted in this notion of poetry, Maritain's unique notion of poetry. Now, to Bergson in philosophy, Léon Blois in literature, he was a novelist, and the Catholic faith. When Maritain for Raïssa moved to Meudon, which near Versailles, to be so Raïssa could be near to Father Clarisac, her spiritual advisor, he actually had as a neighbor the famous modern painter Georges Rouault. And so through friendship and social encounters with Rouault, Maritain had access to a first-rate, first-class painter. I've seen Rouault's in the Vatican Museum. I live in Canton, Ohio now. I've seen them in the Cleveland Museum of Art as well. In fact, there's a wonderful book published by Abrams, Georges Rouault, that is not all, but a great catalog of the paintings of Rouault, and Maritain wrote the introduction to that. So there are those three in particular. And then in 1919, Maritain and Raisa's sister, Vera, came to live with them, and they would hold on Sunday afternoons what they referred to as the Thomist Circle. And these were people who would come on a Sunday afternoon, and they would discuss texts selected in advance that they could prepare, and they would discuss these texts and then end with a social gathering and so forth. And one of the members of that guest was Yves Simon. And in a book that Yves Simon published together, his name is right on the tip of my tongue. You'll help me out here. Who is the author who wrote Black Like Me?
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm looking for the book right now. Yeah, it's right over there. It'll come to me. It'll come back to me. But anyway, he wrote they together wrote a book as an homage to Jacques Maritain in Life and Pictures.
Is it John Griffin?
It is. John Howard Griffin. Thank you.
That's a great text. Yeah, you're talking about that coffee. It's not thick, but a coffee table book
Yep.
of size.
Yep. And in it, and now I'm going to reach over and grab the text, because I think it says a lot about the question you asked me about what made Maritain so unique, not just philosophically, but dispositionally. And so this is Yves Simon writing in that homage to Maritain in Life and Pictures. Yves Simon says, quote, "I have some notion of the people whose company Jacques Maritain liked. For over a long period, it was my privilege to visit his home on Sunday afternoons. The living room was generally crowded, less by teachers or students than by writers, poets, painters, musicians, persons interested in mysticism, missionaries, and friends of the missions. Most of the artists who passed through the doors, I skipped. Most of the artists were of the vanguard description." And so let me give you a quick list of people who attended these Thomist circles. Artists, this is a random sampling that I've assembled. For writers and poets, André Gide, Françoise Mauriac, Jean Cocteau, Julian Green, John Howard Griffin, Max Jacob, and Pierre Revardy. Painters, Pablo Picasso, Marc Chagall, Gino Severini, Georges Rouault. Musicians, Igor Stravinsky, Georges Auric, Eric Satie. Philosophers, Gabriel Marcel, Etienne Gilson, Yves Simon, Mortimer Adler, Nicholas Berdyaev, and theologians and missionaries, Father Charles Henrion, Father Garrigou Lagrange, Abbe Charles Journet, and Thomas Merton. It's a veritable who's who of early 20th century. And so, with that kind of association, and what I've called this inner disposition, I think there you have it. I also think that Maritain and Raïs's conversion to Catholicism, which coupled him with a reading of Aquinas and his understanding, getting this Thomistic articulation of the what shall we call it, of the existence of the prime, the existence of, I have to do it in the Latin, the ipsum esse subsistens, the self-subsisting act of existing, philosophically God's name, but that God then floods reality with intelligibility and gives us an insight into the limitless depth of the spirituality of the human person. And he was in the company of greatness. So
no, it's good.
I'll rest there.
Oh, well, this is exactly actually how I like these to go. I always say I want others to do the work. Our listeners, people who have at least listened to the other episodes, know that there is a little bit of prep beforehand, so that we're not breaking the fourth wall when I sort of aver directly to prep, because we've covered some of the specific topics that you came here with. We've already had the connaturality and intuition in the background, and it's sort of guided. I think you've thematically guided people to have a sense, at least, so that if they go to engage with the works, they're going to be sensible to paying heed to that. There are two others that we need to hit. I may want to flip them because of what you just said. There's the topic of spiritualized emotion and its role in the particular kind of non-conceptual knowing that is poetry. And there's also, too, this theme that I find really interesting in him, actually, is he plays around in various works with this idea of the spiritual unconscious. I first encountered it in creative intuition, art, and poetry. It's present in, there's that scholasticism and politics he has as a discussion of it. I think it has very interesting things to do with the idea of just speculative intuition. You probably know in Untroubled Approaches, where he talks about kind of intellectual connaturality, the way there's the intuition that you have in that sort of general sense of the word intuition as we use it. But the intuition that a great mind has whenever they realize they sort of see but can't explain for themselves some insight in the sciences or in philosophy.
Right.
And it sort of drives them that they have to now go and figure out how to explain what they've seen, so to speak. I think it plays into that as well, even though he doesn't talk about it there. But I think it's very super important in the philosophy of art stuff for him. And so I'd like you to maybe, if you can, start with a discussion of this. What is it? How does he deploy it a little bit in creative intuition, art, and poetry? I just think it is such a unique, important deepening of the Thomist tradition. Yeah. As you pointed out, he takes Thomas and deepens him. And I think this is super important.
And there are many, I think, unfortunately, Thomists who would be offended by what you say, because there's only Aquinas, and you can't go beyond that.
Oh, it's don't preach, because you and I are on the same page here,
Yeah,
and this
yeah.
is a place for my dyspepsia. May John Dealey, our mutual friend, be remembered, because he would inveigh against that kind of he would call it backward looking tone.
Yeah, yeah.
But I won't put that on your lips.
Yeah.
That's on my lips.
So let me share with you this business of spiritualized emotion.
Okay, I'll let you go first.
Yeah. So for many, many, many years, I would read in Maritain's Creative Intuition and Art and Poetry the part that he says that this plays for the creator in the creation of a work of art. I didn't really know. I was moving concepts about like a glass bead game.
Tokens, yeah.
To make a passing reference to Hermann Hesse. Mm-hmm. But I didn't know it. I didn't get it. And here's how it came to me. And it was right around this time in my last 2 years, maybe, of the Maritain Association. My daughter got married. And about a week after the wedding, she stopped by our house, pick up some things for her new place, and she and I had occasion to sit down and talk. Just daughter to dad. It was quiet. It was intimate. And it was heartfelt. And at one point, unsuspectingly, she turned to me and she said, "Dad, does homesickness ever go away?" And in that instant, the spiritualized emotion and it's like, does it ever go away? Well, in one sense, of course. But in another sense, no. It never goes away because it becomes that feeling of homesickness and everything that it represents. Your mother, your father, home life, your own room, a routine of the way in which we do things here. And now you're living with someone new for the first time, and everything in your surrounding, not just your husband, but everything in your surrounding is new. And it's a natural human longing for the familiar and what you have known all your life. And I think we label that homesickness. And it can be a felt emotion that over time, the feeling may go away. Maritain calls that subjective emotion. It's felt and experienced. Over time, that will fade away. But the impact of it on the fiber of one's being never goes away, becomes part of who you are as a person. And now I'm going back to Maritain's definition of poetry, the inner being of things, her life, living here, everything connected to it, and her new life. And that is, a radical ratcheting and change, and the inner being of the human self. And so she is the one who's undergoing and experiencing this. And were she an artist, she is not, but I can say she's the most caring nurse if anything ever happens, Matthew. She will take remarkable care of you. But, because of this, if she were an artist, and if she was doing something visually, writing novels or drawing about homesickness, that experience of what she lived, it's not conceptual. See, there's Maritain's poetry. It's not conceptual, but it becomes part of the fiber of her being. And this non-conceptual form of connaturality, she can tell you things because she's lived them. This plays an instrumental role, Maritain says, in the creation of a work of art. And that's why there are countless numbers, and today is the feast of Our Lady of
Guadalupe.
Guadalupe. I was going to say Guatemala. Of Guadalupe. So there are countless numbers of paintings or poems for the Virgin Mary, but no two of them are ever alike. And the reason they're never alike is because they're coming from an artist who is, each person, uniquely his or her own self. And so what issues from that artist in a creative, poetic way is also unique. And that idea, from anything non-conceptual to poetry to spiritualized emotion, forms of connaturality and intuition, all of that, because it's not part of our conceptual, intellectual life, they become part of, I use the expression, the fiber of our being, but because they're intellectual, they got to come from somewhere. And Maritain, I think, astutely says the human person has not just one source of not one, but two reservoirs, so to speak, of intellectual activity. One of them, Freud, who was, hot back in the early 1900s, right? Rightly identified. Maritain expresses, to my knowledge, this spiritual unconscious in creative intuition and art and poetry, which is the 50s. So there's many years for Freud's idea to gain traction. And one of the things that I've learned is that, technically speaking, we shouldn't use the word unconscious. It is really an activity of our psyche that is not conscious. And we see this in dreams, and the way in which dreams can be spiritually charged. I said spiritually, I meant to say symbolically charged. And through a kind of therapy, it becomes possible to learn to read the symbolism found in dreams that otherwise may be severely bizarre. Mm-hmm. But what, Maritain is asking, what is the condition of great art that issues from a person? What is the condition of its origin? And anyway, what about those who, we read about these scripturally, like Mary having the encounter, like Joseph having the encounter with an angel in a dream that is a real encounter, not something that is a function of the Freudian unconscious, but something that is a contact point between the spiritual realm and the spiritual dimension of the human person. Maritain, in Creative Intuition, not only talks about those two, but he also says, and this is pretty close to a quote, when he says, we know that we know, but we don't always know how we know. And he says that this kind of spiritual dimension of the human person, and now we're talking specifically about a spiritual unconscious, would be something that we are not conscious of, but this kind of communion and communication does take place between the artist or the mystic, everyone really, in our development of intellectual knowledge. And so Maritain, I think, rightly gives that a home. And
he's, yeah. Go
yes.
ahead.
No, yeah, I mean, he says that it, and I'm sure you know this, to those who maybe, if you stayed with us this far and this long, then you may know that, and if you don't, I'm telling you, it's wonderful, that in Creative Intuition and Art and Poetry, there is a diagram that Maritain has, and it talks about the way in which chronologically the embryo that eventually becomes the young baby, that eventually becomes the teenager and matures into a person, that we go through stages. First our vegetative stage, then our sensitive stage, and then eventually the intellectual stage. Newborn babies don't have a functioning intellect the way in which we do when we mature. These three stages are chronologically prior, where the vegetative eventually serves the sensitive, and the sensitive eventually serves the intellectual. Aquinas famously says, nothing in the intellect that isn't first in the senses somehow. So I mention this because in this diagram that Maritain gives, they're cones, and that they seem to emanate one from another, and now it's the intellect which utilizes the senses, which utilize our vegetative aspects. And he draws the Freudian unconscious coming out of our animal. Dogs dream. I'm absolutely convinced of it. I used to watch my dog have a nightmare, and you would see in sleep, mumbling,
legs kicking, and yep.
And so that is a lower animal Freudian unconscious, and then is the spiritual unconscious, which is up in that ethereal spiritual dimension of the human person. And it is out of that all of these concepts that we've talked about, from the spiritual unconscious, spiritualized emotion, intuition, connaturality, and a spiritual universe where the spiritual creator bestows not only a spiritual dimension to creation, but as specific spiritual powers or faculties of the human person.
Yeah. So for those who are, if we've had people still with us and they're Thomists, this is effectively a profound deepening of the relation, well, the nature of of the agent intellect and its relationship to then our other faculties.
Yeah,
It's just
yeah,
this profound development of the fact that, like you said, we know we know what we know, but we don't know the mechanisms of our knowledge except by a kind of reflection. And at most, that's like catching flashes of an immense luminosity that's almost shrouded behind the scenes.
yeah.
And to be aware of this mystery of basically what is the spiritual faculty of the human person. And he talks about it actually in the speculative domain, but here in the artistic domain is just, I mean, he develops Thomism, I think, just in such immensely important ways.
Yeah, I think his philosophy of art, and I think you can expand it to a broader aesthetics. Um, I think is really unique, and for Catholics especially, because of its connection to Aquinas. Um, I think you gotta live. And this you mentioned John Dealey earlier, a fond memory. Uh, John Dealey used to say, "Listen to Maritain." That was his expression. Listen to Maritain. He knows. And I know we're getting close to our hour if we're not over it.
Yeah.
Very quickly.
Yeah, go ahead, because I actually want to ask one more thing about the
Oh,
spiritualized
go
emotion.
ahead.
Because I think I was thinking of something while you gave the example of your daughter, and I
Yes.
want to help land it for people so that they don't think, because people sometimes dismiss this stuff in Maritain and say it's it's a bunch of leftovers of Bergson that he shoehorns into Aquinas. I mean, they just dismiss it. Um, when we say the right thing to someone who needs to have a certain word at a certain time about suffering in their life or about whatever major transition is going on in their life or whatever, when we're present to another person and you have the right word, there is a kind of artfulness to that, right? There's an artfulness to discourse that is, in a sense, it's poetic actually in the ancient sense of a poetic logic of knowing the likenesses to kind of put together to express what needs to be said to this person to communicate. The person who's had that poetic experience that you can't actually, like you said, it's not a conceptual knowledge like what goes on in speculative cognition. That poetic experience of homesickness can guide the way that your daughter or you yourself are able to have the right word to say. Like whatever you said to your daughter then, that was a kind of artistic act flowing from the poetry. It may not have been art in the sense that we sort of want to pick up and fly to the heavens with kind of fine art. But this poetic experience of something like homesickness, for instance, does underlie this regular human phenomenon of being able to kind of communicate in these experiences that have gone into the fiber of our being, right? So it is the poetry drops into the art of discourse with other people or of relating to other people, even if we're not quote unquote artists. So I just really I wanted to see what you think about that, just so people see that this is a universal human phenomenon. So the nurse is using this poetic knowledge is present, even if she's quote unquote not an artist, as you said.
Yeah, because as I use that expression, becoming part of the fiber of who she is, I think the net result is it made her a more intuitive and a more caring nurse. She used to be in the intensive care, and then as she had a child and that schedule became difficult, so she moved out of that. But I had serious surgery in October of 23. And after the surgery, I spent a night in the intensive care. My daughter came up to the intensive care unit where I was, and she was able to do things for me to make me comfortable. None of the other intensive care nurses did that. She knew what I needed without my even asking her, because I didn't know what was permissible or not. They have those things that go on your legs and they, contract and release and so forth. And she, oh, Dad, you don't need these anymore. And oh, you've fallen down. Here, let me help you to sit up. And it was like, oh, this is much better. And she knew all of those things. And Matthew, you have your own children, right? And each of them, each of us, we come into the world with our own unique personalities, our dispositions, our inclinations, and the Lord works in mysterious ways that we ourselves don't even understand, but somehow it all fits together. Why didn't I become a musician? Why did I become a philosopher? And etc., etc., etc. And, you know, my feeling is that, well, love God and love others are the two commands, and everything else is just a form of a gratuitous gift. And God understands the uniqueness that makes each person, from my daughter to you to your daughters, so unique and part of a divine plan that we ourselves, here we are again, conceptually can never encompass. Now, let me mention one final thing. Mm-hmm. Everyone, sorry about this. It'll be quick, but you know, what happened is in reading Maritain, I got, and this is where this whole discussion began, to this definition of poetry. And as I worked on it, I saw that Maritain focused almost entirely on the creativity of the creative artist and the role that poetry plays for that artist. But I recognized that poetry is ontologically prior to what Maritain calls poetic knowledge, which is not conceptual, but it's the making by the artist of the work of art. I saw that poetry was ontologically prior, and there are a few key passages where Maritain talks about poetry even for those who are not creative, like Jeremiah, who only knows how to say ah, ah, ah. And so, and my apologies, this is a shameless self-promotion.
I set you up for it. So yes. You're just supposed to say you're doing it because I told you, you know, we're going to do it at the end.
Well, thank you, Matthew. 2011, it's Catholic University of America Press, and the title, now check it out, Poetry, Beauty, and Contemplation. Poetry, I mean Maritain's poetry. Unfortunately, I don't think that's adequately conveyed in the title, so the subtitle tells it all. It's the complete aesthetics of Jacques Maritain. What I look to do in that book is to say that poetry is available to all of us, even those who may not be creative of works of art, but in our encounter with great works of art, if that work of art was fashioned with a poetry of the creator, that poetry can pass to us. Aquinas has one of his principles: what is received according to the mode of the receiver. And so, some people love opera, some don't. That's not your thing, fine. But don't ever say, opera is no good. What you can say is, I don't particularly like it, but boy, I really like film, or, you know, whatever it might happen to be. if the creative artist has passed that poetry on to the work, here's another Thomist principle. Something cannot give what it does not have. And so if that poetry is part of the creator, it passes to the work, and non-conceptually, through a spiritualized emotion or encounter, one can be profoundly moved by great works of art. And I look to develop that so as, again, back to poetry, a complete aesthetics of Jacques Maritain.
Good. So I do recommend that to those who are interested in sort of getting them a full framework for being able to encounter Maritain on this, because it is difficult when people pick up, even if they're Thomists, right? Because if they're Thomists, but they're sort of historical Thomists, they may find it to be foreign because he's doing something new. If someone were looking to read him first too, how do you recommend? This will be our kind of closing question.
Yeah.
What work do you end up recommending people start with?
Well, you know, Maritain's first book, I mentioned it earlier, a kind of tribute and critical analysis of Bergson. His second book is called Art and Scholasticism. What I like about it, and many others have liked it as well, including T.S. Eliot, is that it is very analytical, very well organized, and takes you through essential distinctions. Because, as I would often say to students in my class, distinctions are to the mind what a focusable lens is to the eye. And not only can we say, I see your library behind you, Matthew, I can also say, do you see what I mean? And seeing needs focus, and distinctions provide that focus. And Maritain's Art and Scholasticism, while not my favorite book, is a gem because of the way in which it dissects and lays things down in a very precise way. For me, Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, 1953, it includes poetry in the lowercase p. It includes, if you get the big book, it was Maritain's Mellon lectures for the Museum of Art in Washington, D.C. And it's a masterpiece, and it includes all of these great paintings and so forth and so on. It discusses the history of painting. It discusses Maritain's theory of creative activity. And that, for me, I would say, is the gem.
It's that's I figured. I sort of wondered what you'd say about art and scholasticism, so I'm not surprised that you point out its clarity, and then however, I mean, it's back on the shelf a little bit for you.
But I would say, if you're going to read that, make sure you read the footnotes.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
And
yes.
The reason is, and this is what I did in preparation for the book that I did on Maritain's aesthetics, is Maritain had some footnotes in the 1920 edition. He added others in 1927. In 1927, he did the book Art and Faith. It was letters that he exchanged with Jean Cocteau. And the word poetry does not appear, as we've discussed it, in art and scholasticism. The word appears in Art and Faith, 1927, but there's no definition of it. And then in 1935, another issue comes out, and he adds footnotes again. By 1935, he's developed pretty much this notion of poetry. And so I think that these footnotes get progressively richer from 1927 to 1935. In 1935, he does art and poetry, and by poetry, there is an ambiguity, but you really get in there a clear foretaste of what will be the definition that we began with, the first page of creative intuition in art and poetry.
That's good. That's great. I actually wanted people to have just a general sense of how the progression and development works. They can, of course, look to your book to see that spelled out in more detail then.
Yeah, I develop his own chronological development of poetry in there as a way of substantiating my case that to attribute poetic contemplation to Jacques Maritain is sort of like, and I can't think of his name at the moment, but Gustav Mahler did 9 symphonies, and he only sketched out the 10th. And I can't think of his name, did the 10th symphony, and it is called Mahler's 10th, and then it's this particular person's interpretation, I guess, if you'd like, of that 10th symphony, taking it not just from a structure, but to an actual piece of orchestral music.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, do you have any last words? I'd like to leave the guest have last words if you desire, or we're good to go.
Yeah, there's a famous story about Mortimer Adler, and he may have been talking with William F. Buckley, on Firing Line. Not sure. I could have that wrong. But the famous story, and there's real concern about, and this goes back to the 50s, about the atomic bomb and how one person could prompt another person and another and another, and before you know it, the whole world goes up in a massive conflagration. And one or the other of these two says, do you have any last words? And I think it's Bill Buckley who says something to the effect of, well, given historical events, these indeed may be the last words. So I think I'll just rest on what I've already shared.
There we have it. So, all right. Well, thank you.
My pleasure.
Dr. Trapani, for your time. This was a very nice time together this afternoon and evening. But thank you also to all of you who've stayed around and have listened to or watched us for this. This has been Maritain Musings, a service, if we want to call it that, of the American Maritain Association. I've been Matthew Miner, your host. I
need to add, and thank you, Matthew, on the part of our treasured Maritain Association for doing these.
Thank you, John.
It's a invaluable contribution to Maritain scholarship, and so, listeners, we all owe Matthew a great debt of gratitude. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, for that as well. And we'll also give appropriate gratitude to Mr. Michael Hall, who will go and make all of this work online for us, our graduate assistant who's helping us.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you, everyone. And this has been, again, Maritain Musings.
Thank you. Bye bye, everybody.